The United States is the most powerful empire the world has ever known. It's risen to this status through a combination of incredible natural geography, abundant natural resources, a number of historical accidents, good governance, and a culture of innovation. To cement this status, the US often pursues practical global policies that enhance its power, often at the expense of other nations. Empires like the US don't come into being by being moral and kind. They do so by making expedient choices to bolster their own power. It should come as no surprise, then, that a major world power would be hypocritical. To maintain its power, the US should only follow the rules that help it to remain powerful, while applying different rules to other countries. Like any superpower, the US should seek to expand its own influence while constraining the influence of its rivals. How the US has exercised this power, whether for good or bad, is a matter of debate. On the one hand, the US has fought just wars, like World War II, spread liberal values like free speech, free trade, and human rights, advanced technology and innovation, and led institutions like the United Nations that help the free people of Earth. On the other hand, we all too often are involved in horrific conflicts like the Vietnam and Iraq wars, imperialist wars that led to unimaginable suffering to vulnerable people far away. Along with liberal values, we've helped to spread a distinct American materialism and capitalism that's exploited the natural world and led us to environmental catastrophe and increased global inequality. America can be a force for immense good or immense evil. Therefore, the policies that it chooses, constraining or expanding its power, can result in immense good or immense harm. Our topic today is itself such a policy. The United States is not a party to the International Criminal Court, the court responsible for trying war crimes and other atrocities. Although the US praises the ICC when it prosecutes its enemies, namely Russia, it is hostile to the ICC when investigating its own crimes, for example in Afghanistan, or the war crimes of its allies, like Israel's war crimes in Palestine. Again, this hypocrisy is natural for a superpower and should come as no surprise. Today, we debate whether the US should join the ICC, thus applying global accountability to all of its misdeeds, or whether the US should stay out, thus preserving all of its options, without the threat of the International Court looking over its shoulder. Here is your resolution. The United States should accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now I present your February 2025 topic. Welcome to the debate. This video will comprise 3 parts. First, a background of the ICC and the US's involvement with the court. Second, why the US should join the ICC, affirmative. And last, why the US should not join the ICC, negative. 2 quick things before we begin. First, all evidence cited can be found at debatetrack.com. Your subscription fee keeps these lectures free, and buying a brief is the best way to support this channel. Thank you all so much for supporting Debate Track and for fueling accessible debate, lectures open to everyone. 2, all evidence cited here and the quotes I read are not cut the same way as in debate rounds. They're not read verbatim. Now, let's begin. Once again, your resolution. The United States should accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Let's look at the terms involved here one by one. The Rome Statute is the 89-page document that sets up the ICC. It is a lot of legal jargon, but I've linked it in the description if you want to look. Accession to the Rome Statute means to formally sign on to it, accepting the treaty's terms. For the rest of this lecture, I'll just say join the ICC or stay out of the ICC because that's what acceding to the Rome Statute really means. The International Criminal Court tries crimes against individuals in cases of genocide, war crimes, or other massive crimes. The ICC is based in The Hague, a Dutch city, and is not part of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, by contrast, tries disputes between states. The ICJ is part of the UN, and confusingly is also based in The Hague. We will not be discussing the ICJ today. For much of history, countries and their leaders were immune from prosecution for crimes. However, large-scale atrocities in the 20th century changed this view. McAllister, 22, is professor of political science at Kenyon College. They outline this history, quote, "Before World War II, impunity, the view that neither states nor state officials should be held accountable for atrocity crimes, represented the reigning orthodoxy in world politics. The horrors of the Holocaust led to calls for some form of accountability. The Allies settled on the Nuremberg, shown here, and then Tokyo tribunals to provide international accountability for war crimes and aggressive warfare. The experience of the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials ultimately led for calls to establish a permanent institution to punish aggression and atrocities. Ultimately, however, the project failed to gain steam until after the Cold War, when great power support for ad hoc tribunals in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda renewed hope that a permanent international criminal court might be possible. Thus, the ICC was formed in 2002 after 60 countries ratified the statute. The ICC, therefore, is quite young. Some of you probably have siblings as old as the ICC. How exactly it should function in the world is still being ironed out, but recent ICC arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu have brought it to the fore in international discussions of justice. Now, we know the ICC tries international crimes, but where exactly does this jurisdiction start and end? In fact, the ICC can only act in specific circumstances. First, the ICC only has jurisdiction in its member states. It doesn't investigate crimes in non-member states, although any crimes committed in its member states are fair game, no matter who committed the crime. For example, although the US is not a member state, US crimes in Afghanistan, an ICC member, would fall under its jurisdiction. Second, scope. The ICC only investigates the most severe crimes, which fall under 4 categories: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. I'm going to keep this lecture generic and vague about what the specifics of these crimes are, but you all have internet access and should look some of the specific cases up if you think that would be edifying to you rather than traumatizing for you. In addition to these 4 categories, a 5th category has recently been proposed: crimes against the environment, or ecocide. Such an amendment would require a 2/3 vote of ICC members, and to clarify, again, is not one of the official crimes. So, the ICC isn't really set up to investigate all crimes, or really any minor crimes at all. Only the most heinous crimes that humans can perpetuate are under its jurisdiction. In fact, according to Machak and Nyes 22, quote, "The court is under an obligation to declare a case inadmissible if it is not of sufficient gravity," end quote. Another ongoing point of debate is whether the ICC should be able to try corporations who are often responsible for resource-based or their crimes during war. However, because the ICC only tries individuals, it is not currently set up to try corporations. In the meantime, many national governments are unable to prosecute their own corporations for crimes committed beyond national borders, so a gap exists in trying corporations for international crimes. Third, referrals. Cases can be referred to the court through 3 parties: the UN Security Council, an official ICC prosecutor working in the Office of the Prosecutor, or OTP, or a state party. The vast majority of cases come from the last one, states that refer cases to the ICC, who often have issues trying the defendants in their national courts, often for political reasons, because often the people who are committing these heinous crimes are leaders or at least very powerful people. Fourth, judicial failures. In cases where the crimes in question are adequately investigated and tried by the member country, the ICC is not supposed to intervene. In this way, the court is a court of last resort, intended to intervene if and only if the member country cannot or will not investigate the crime. The ICC can impose a number of punishments on those found guilty: imprisonment, fines, seizures of assets, and reparations to victims. The ICC cannot put people to death. In addition, plea bargains can be struck between prosecutors and defendants. These are explicitly authorized in the Rome Statute, although they are rarely used. An uncut article in Foreign Policy called "The ICC Can Use Plea Bargains to Hold Russia Accountable for War Crimes in Ukraine" advocates for expanding plea bargains to cover more international criminals. The idea is that criminals would essentially come to the ICC to get their records expunged, striking a plea bargain so that they don't have to flee the ICC and international justice. And they may not have incredibly long prison sentences, maybe just a slap on the wrist, but still, they'd be able to cover many, many more people than they normally do. However, this plea bargain expansion is outside of the scope of this debate, probably, which is why I haven't cut this particular card. Members, The ICC has 125 members, with Ukraine being the latest to join in October 2024. Canada, Mexico, all countries of South America, all European countries, and many African countries are members. However, there are 70 non-members. Most of Asia hasn't joined the ICC, nor have the major global powers, US, China, India, or Russia, nor Indonesia. Countries in orange on this map, like Russia and the US, have previously signed but withdrew their signatures. The US is decidedly anti-ICC. Although the US helped to negotiate the text of the Rome Statute and signed the agreement in 2002, it then withdrew its signature and has never ratified the statute. US criticisms of the ICC often stem from its lack of compatibility with US law. For example, the ICC doesn't uphold trial by jury, which is guaranteed to US citizens under the US Constitution. No reasonable bail is set, another provision of US law, and once handed over, suspects are held at The Hague until they are convicted or found innocent. Successive presidents have been openly hostile toward the ICC. The American Service Members Protection Act, colloquially called the Hague Invasion Act, was signed under George W. Bush. This act enables the president to, quote, use all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of any U.S. or allied personnel being detained by or on behalf of or at the request of the International Criminal Court, end quote. A note, in AF's world, reasonable ground dictates that the ASMS, the Hague Invasion Act, would be nullified. We wouldn't join the ICC while simultaneously stipulating that we should invade The Hague if the ICC issued an arrest warrant for a U.S. citizen. Donald Trump revoked visas and levied sanctions against ICC members in anticipation of investigations into crimes committed during the war in Afghanistan. Max Boot is a historian and biographer and is, like many, deeply opposed to Trump's targeting of ICC officials. Quote, the United States used to be committed to an international rules-based order, no longer. Trump has turned America into a rogue regime that is hostile to laws and norms, whether at home or abroad, end quote. With Trump 2 looming, including a potential reemerging of American imperialism proper, the international rules-based order has never been more shaky. Given that the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly to sanction the ICC on Friday, January 10th, 2 days ago my time, the bill sanctioning the ICC over Israel may be one of the very first that Trump signs when coming into office. And although Joe Biden lifted these Trump-era sanctions, he openly criticized ICC members after arrest warrants were issued for Israeli leaders in 2024. In addition, Secretary of State Blinken said he'd work with Congress to reimpose those sanctions on the ICC. I don't know if he actually did anything to work with the Congress, but Congress has gone ahead and begun the process of imposing those sanctions. U.S. opposition remains loud and vocal due to the creeping nature of international norms. If enough countries start acting a certain way, for example, bowing to ICC pressure, the U.S. could get dragged along with these international norms, and they could become what is called common international law, where every country is expected to abide by these rules, even if the U.S. never agreed to them. In addition, the U.S. has signed bilateral immunity agreements, also called Article 98 agreements, with 38 countries. These agreements are promises not to transfer U.S. citizens to the ICC, even if that person is being investigated or has been convicted by the court. Some of this happens under pressure. For example, Mali, Namibia, and South Africa all refused to sign these agreements with the U.S. and subsequently saw cuts to U.S. aid to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Now, as the world's most notorious warfighter, the U.S. has plenty to answer for in terms of war crimes. The ICC has investigated war crimes committed by service members in Afghanistan, but crimes committed in Iraq, at CIA black sites, military sites like Guantanamo Bay, and other areas might put thousands of U.S. service members in the line of sight of an empowered ICC if the U.S. were to join. And this could go all the way to the top. George Bush, for example, started wars that led to some 1 million deaths. He would be considered a war criminal by any reasonable metric. The invasion of Iraq was certainly the U.S.'s largest policy blunder, if that's what you want to call it. It was embarrassing, immoral, and truly deserving of the gallows for all the leaders involved. I say that with no sarcasm. Bring out the gallows. Marjorie Cohn is a professor at Thomas Jefferson Law School, quote, after the Holocaust, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg wrote, To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Here is the author of that quote. Likewise, Obama, to a lesser degree, could be considered a war criminal for his notorious drone strikes that killed almost 4,000 people during his presidency, most of those civilians. The U.S. is also concerned with protecting its allies from judgment by the ICC. Israel has been accused of war crimes in Palestinian territories for decades, and its recent large-scale war in Gaza and beyond isn't helping this image. In return for the ICC criticism, a returning Trump has promised a great many more sanctions against ICC members, which the House of Representatives prepared by voting in favor of these sanctions on January 10th. Again, pushback from the U.S. links to the progression of common international law. If something becomes a norm, then the U.S. is increasingly pressured to abide by that norm. Here's Kahana 125, quote, Trump administration officials widely view Israel's situation as a precedent, believing the U.S. would face similar warrants next, leading them to treat these actions against Israeli leaders as potential precursors to targeting American leadership and military command. Unsurprisingly, the U.S. is less critical of the ICC when it concerns its enemies. Arrest warrants have also been issued for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over the forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. In response, Biden praised the ICC and welcomed the warrants. Now, if I've done a good job correctly, you should now understand how the U.S. views the ICC, generally poorly. Next, we will discuss what would the world look like if the U.S. pulled a 180 and began to support the International Criminal Court. By the way, if I have done my job well thus far, please drop me a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. So, let's start on affirmative here with uniqueness and links. Why does the ICC matter? Why is it beneficial if more countries join? And why is U.S. membership in particular necessary for the ICC to gain legitimacy and to advance its goals? The ICC is the first international body set up to try crimes of atrocity, the most grotesque crimes humanity seems capable of. From a long historical view, this is an incredible achievement. Frankly, humanity has never made it this far in holding the worst amongst us to justice. Now, some may criticize the ICC for its relative lack of power. Leaders of powerful countries are indeed more powerful than the ICC and thus are able to evade justice, but that doesn't diminish the ICC's importance. Azizi is a writer and historian. He speaks about the recent arrest warrant for Israel's leader. Quote, Netanyahu, like many others wanted by that court, will probably never appear before it, but that doesn't make the ruling meaningless. International justice has more significance in the world today than at any previous time in human history. Dozens of treaties obligate countries around the world. Viewed from a long historical perspective, this is a grand achievement. And last week's ruling, by demonstrating an equal application of international law to a Western country, advances that cause. End quote. The ICC, therefore, is a body worth supporting and a body worth joining. And every country counts. Quote, each ramification adds another brick to the wall that protects humanity from the gravest crimes imaginable. More than 70 member states are still not party to the Rome Statute. This ensures that victims of atrocities committed in territories of non-state parties are left to anguish outside the zone of justice. As United Nations 19. In fact, the goal should be universal membership. The ICC acts to bring bad guys to justice, and only through universal membership can we ensure that bad guys have no place to hide. This goes doubly and triply and quadruply true for the U.S. Mostly just because it is such a powerful international actor. Having the weight of the U.S. empire behind the ICC would give it legitimacy and reach beyond what it currently does, helping to advance the goals of enacting justice for the victims of crimes of atrocities. All that said, the ICC isn't perfect. International law has always been aspirational until we achieve an all-wise utopian world government, something in fact we would be wise to avoid. All we can do is build on our successes. If there are deficiencies, we should work to improve them, rather than throwing out the best system humanity has thus far developed. Remember, the ICC was formed in 2002. Even by standards of international bodies, it is a new organization. Ibn Omar is a U.S. congressperson, and speaking of the ICC, she says, quote, many will argue that there are parts of the criminal court that need to be reformed. I agree. Let's work as a member state to improve it and make sure it lives up to the highest standards of impartiality." End quote. The ICC's effectiveness is proved through deterrence. This fact links into every other benefit of the court if, in fact, it provides deterrence. Then, crimes under its purview, again, the very worst crimes possible, will be reduced. Chile, Obe Osoji, is a Nigerian jurist, pictured here. In talking about his experience in Africa, he says, quote, "The ICC's existence was a very significant factor that prevented bloodshed. This is because everyone has seen that whoever would commit such violence might end up before the ICC to answer for their actions. That deterrent value is enough of a reason to support the ICC." How about those out of reach of an ICC arrest, as is often the case for countries that refuse to cooperate? Even for them, the ICC enacts penalties on such individuals, as the leaders must change their travel plans and avoid traveling altogether to certain places for fear of that country fulfilling the ICC's arrest warrant. Almost no one actually wants to get arrested, even war criminals. This fact is prominent in the case of Vladimir Putin, whose ICC warrant has made him subject to arrest in any of the 125 country parties to the ICC. This has practical effects, with the leader being notably absent at international summits like the Group of 20 in Brazil or the BRICS meeting in South Africa. So even for the world's arguably first, second, potentially third, probably second most powerful person in the world, the ICC still has tangible consequences for the man. It's certainly not a powerless organization. There are consequences it can enact. Okay, but why the US in particular? On top of the uniqueness that the US always carries with its control of global bodies like the UN and its massive diplomatic, military, and economic weight, these are always unique aspects of the US that it can bring to some kind of international policy. In addition, the affirmative rule gives us an extra advantage in bolstering the ICC's mission. You see, the US is perhaps the biggest opponent of the ICC. Every president since the ICC's inception has at least voiced concerns about ICC membership. And even Biden, who's praised the court for its investigations into Russia, has also criticized the court in its investigations into Israel, calling them outrageous. Trump, meanwhile, has been the most outspoken critic of the ICC, calling them corrupt and unaccountable and a threat to U.S. interests. John Bolton, a perpetual Washington insider and a member of Trump's cabinet, has even called for its abolishment. And this opposition matters. Messaging from the U.S. is powerful and sends a clear message to the world. For a start, sanctions on ICC members prevent them from doing their jobs. These sanctions that prevent ICC investigators from traveling to certain countries, and further proposed Trump sanctions may further complicate their investigations. So, in as much as the ICC works to uphold international criminal law, these sanctions work to tear them down because they stop the ICC investigators from, again, working. For example, ICC attacks on the ICC from the President and Congress are direct attacks on international humanitarian law itself, signaling to allied leaders, Israel in this context, that, quote, they can slaughter people with impunity. We'll see a longer version of this quote later. The impact is that fighting the growing number of transnational threats around the world in places like Afghanistan and Sudan and Venezuela are made harder due to the U.S.'s intentional attacks. Freeman 1224 cautions the U.S. against these sanctions. Quote, non-state actors, including private militaries and terrorist groups, are well equipped with disruptive technologies, which are proliferating at a rate that makes it challenging for governments. The convergence of these technologies is leading to the rapid expansion of asymmetric threats. The ICC can't act now. This capability is something the U.S. should welcome, not impede. Sanctions legislation against the ICC would be grievous and potentially irreparable mistake. As the United States' own intelligence threat assessments underline, it will also make U.S. citizens less safe at home and abroad. End quote. Ultimately, this will damage global peace. According to Rospodowski 22, quote, America's diplomatic efforts, which consistently curb the role of international justice and actively subvert international legal norms, seem at best mislaid. In the long term, America's hostile attitude towards international law and its institutions will adversely affect international peace and stability. End quote. But don't fret, dear listener. Don't fret. Despite all these attacks, there is something we might do. If the U.S. attacks stop in AF's world, then the benefits of solving all the harms might alone be reason enough to vote AF. How might this happen? Well, I have two ideas, but I encourage you to think of more. First, the tide might change when the U.S. begins to support the ICC. It might be easier to support a treaty that we're already signed on to, where our contributions are being felt, and where any issues the US has with the ICC are being solved by the US. Indeed, we already see general support from countries that are ICC members, so why would the US be any different? For example, in response to recent US attacks on the ICC following the Israeli arrest warrants, 93 nations signed a letter in support of the ICC, including Canada, Mexico, Germany, and France. Second way that joining the ICC might solve all of these US attacks with all of their harms. Second, the support the US gives by joining the ICC might counteract the impacts of this opposition from certain US individuals. If the might of the US bureaucracy, including its diplomatic apparatus, were thrown behind the ICC, perhaps the critical voices would fade into the background. It's kind of like if I stole your lunch money and then handed you a bag of gold. Yes, I did steal your lunch money. That's true, and that wasn't right. But you kind of don't care about it anymore now that you have a bag of gold. Formal US support for the ICC might likewise drown voices of opposition. So, this is why joining the ICC matters, and why the US acceding to the Rome Statute is particularly important. But what exactly does the ICC even do? In the next two sections, we'll see how the ICC fights the bad guys and helps the good guys. The ICC remains the only court dedicated to prosecuting the international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. No, it's not perfect, but without it, we're left with an absolute vacuum in international law. Mass slaughter, mass starvation, invasion of sovereign states, and a slew of unspeakable acts would be left without even a threat or a hope of accountability. The US must remain dedicated to trying the worst evils known to mankind, and must show this dedication by acceding to the Rome Statute. Authoritarianism is the new communism. Our geopolitical era is defined by the struggle between liberal democracies and authoritarian dictatorships, and it's hardly clear who's winning. In this context, the role of the ICC is increasingly important. Yevgeny Vindman is a former colonel in the US Army. He says the ICC support may deter China and other regimes bent on a reordering of our global map. Quote, "The costs of not supporting the court are now too high in a world where authoritarian empires are once again embracing aggressive neocolonial warfare against their sovereign neighbors. The US should cease its objections and robustly support and perhaps even fully join the ICC. Doing so will strengthen US foreign policy and international leadership for decades to come. If the global community can put up a united front to hold Russia accountable for its crimes, other would-be aggressors, especially Russia's backers in Beijing, would take note." End quote. Now, these wonderful tropes of the liberal order versus authoritarianism that have evolved from the trope of democracies versus communism, unfortunately, given the crazy stuff that our new president has said this week, much less the stuff that he'll say next week, may have thrown this nice dichotomy into question, and these tropes may have to be quickly rethought. A number of more exotic crimes may also fall under the purview of the ICC. Again, there's only 4 categories of crime explicit in the ICC's mandate, but they tie into many other crimes. I'll give 3 examples in order of the solidity of ICC authority over them. Cybercrimes often involve destroying critical infrastructure, including civilian infrastructure. International law explicitly prohibits this. Civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools are protected. Such law does not differentiate between technologies. So destroying a critical dam, for example, with a cyber attack may carry a similar weight as destroying it with a missile, not taking into account any deaths that might result. Cultural crimes include the destruction of cultural artifacts, religious structures, artworks, and other cultural objects and sites that help to preserve the spirit of a culture. As genocide is as much about destroying the spirit of a people as their bodies, these crimes are linked to the crime of genocide. Fitzgibbon 21, quote, "Acts imposing conditions of life calculated to bring about a group's physical destruction that also target or affect cultural heritage as part of a genocidal campaign inflict ruinous conditions of life on a group." End quote. And therefore, the ICC likely has jurisdiction over these crimes. At a bare minimum, cultural crimes act as key evidence in genocide trials. But there is precedent for trying cultural crimes themselves. In 2012, a leader of a Malian jihadist group was sentenced to ICC for 9 years in prison for destroying historic sites in Timbuktu, all of these sites being UNESCO-protected World Heritage Sites. Last example, ecocide, killing of the environment. Ecocide, again, is being debated to add to the ICC's official list of crimes. Such crimes could be charged in connection to a war or during times of peace, because you can presumably raise a forest no matter what's happening around you. Trees are not that hard to cut down. Although it may not be a proper F argument, as ecocide isn't actually covered by the ICC, and the US is no guarantor of this change coming to pass, it is interesting to note, at least. Now, the provisions of the Rome Statute don't just help to fight the bad guys. They also actively help the good guys. The Rome Statute actually establishes three bodies: the ICC itself, the Assembly of State Parties, which provide management and oversight to the ICC, and the Trust Fund for Victims. The TFV provides aids to victims of crimes under ICC purview. It has helped survivors of sexual violence, former child soldiers, disabled, disfigured, and tortured people, and vulnerable children, including orphans. In total, more than 400,000 victims have benefited from TFV support. The TFV is empowered to work in general areas affected by atrocities, so its work can help to repair damage not just to individuals and families, but to communities and the regions that they're part of. The US should join the ICC to support the work of the TFV. The ICC also provides an outlet for NGOs to address crimes in their areas of work. NGOs can directly petition ICC prosecutors, submit evidence to the ICC, and lobby governments to pressure prosecutors to hold to account actors who commit international crime. So, the ICC helps the good guys and fights the bad guys, and US support will increase its ability to do both. But the biggest benefits to the US are more direct, raising the moral credibility of America herself. For a start, the values the ICC advances, i.e. actively opposing large-scale atrocities, are shared, or at the very least should be shared, by the United States. A 2022 bill in the House of Representatives, sponsored by Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, again notes that, quote, "It is in line with American values, interests, and proud history as a global leader in the fight against impunity and for justice that the U.S. become a full member of the International Criminal Court," end quote. And the U.S. public agrees, with up to 65% of Americans supporting joining the ICC. Fairness under the law is a cornerstone of every reasonable legal system. Only through equally applying the law to all actors, big and small, can the law remain legitimate and accepted by all. Although the ICC has been accused of anti-Africa and pro-Western bias, its recent arrest warrants for Israeli leaders prove that it's capable of meting out justice wherever these crimes are committed. Again, Azizi 1124, quote, "Almost all of the court's top funders are Western democracies or their allies. For the first time in its history, the ICC would be asked to assess the actions of a democratically elected government allied with the West, and to show that it could do so without special favor. Last Thursday, the ICC rose to the challenge. For years, many non-Western leaders have accused the court of having a pro-Western bias. The arrest warrants against Israeli leaders offer the ICC an opportunity to prove otherwise," end quote. To be clear, Affirmative does not need to advocate for an Israeli ICC conviction, nor are they forced to critique the government's actions, although of course you're welcome to do so, and I expect Israel will be a huge focus of the debates for this topic. All we're asking in this case is to leave these questions to an unbiased court of law. Let the investigation proceed, let Netanyahu and Gallant have their day in court, and if and only if they're found guilty, let them face consequences for their misdeeds. What we're asking here is just for international leaders who are accused of committing war crimes to have an investigation and not just be let off the hook because they're America's friends. And joining the ICC would help to enable that. Insofar as the US rejects fairness under the law by failing to join the ICC, it may fairly be accused of hypocrisy. The US holds double standards for investigations that it deems are for or against its interests, rather than those that are, for example, just or unjust. Notably, the US has praised arrest warrants for Russian leaders while shamelessly ignoring its own recent crimes, which have seen no accountability at all. Cohen 23, quote, "Speaking about the war in Ukraine, President Joe Biden recently declared the apparent absurdity of the idea that over 100,000 forces would invade another country. Since World War II, nothing like that has happened. Biden apparently forgot about Operation Iraqi Freedom," end quote. This leads Zunes 524 to say, quote, "It appears, in Washington's view, international humanitarian law should only apply to leaders not supported by the United States." This hypocrisy is especially notable in the case of America's support of Israel against ICC investigations. Freeman, 1224, contrasts the U.S. treatment of allies and adversaries. Quote, Despite the U.S.'s stance on prosecuting citizens of non-state parties, it lauded and supported this move against Russia, only to take a contradictory stance when similar circumstances apply to Israel. This violates the fundamental principle that the law should be applied even-handedly and consistently." End quote. This hypocrisy, acting one way towards our enemies and another in regard to our own crime and those of our friends, this double standard sends a clear and strong message to our allies. Again, Zunes, quote, "As long as the current administration and congressional leadership is in power, future war criminals from allied states will know that they can slaughter people with impunity, and the United States will have their backs." Zunes continues elsewhere. "The angry reactions from President Joe Biden's administration and congressional leaders are not simply another defense of Israel's war crimes, but an attack on international humanitarian law itself. Biden denounced this report as outrageous, marking the first time in U.S. history that a sitting president has openly sided with suspected war criminals against the ICC." Joining the ICC by affirming this resolution will enable the U.S. to overcome these accusations of hypocrisy. And speaking about issuance of Israeli arrest warrants, Ishant Rohr, a foreign affairs columnist, says, quote, "The move was a long-awaited opportunity to end the decades-long cycle of impunity that Israel enjoys in its occupation of the Palestinian territories, and to restore the credibility of the international justice system as a whole." End quote. And David Sheffer, a former U.S. ambassador at large for war crimes issues, says there is a simple solution to these double standards. Quote, "In dialogues with foreign scholars, lawyers, think tankers, diplomats, and journalists, there arises the constant refrain that American invocations about international criminal justice fall on deaf ears overseas, particularly in the global south, because of the foreign perception of double standards. The complaint centers on the United States negotiating treaties like the Rome Statute that it does not ratify. The United States would begin to overcome the double standards perception, which cripples our influence on so many fronts, including international criminal justice, if the U.S. Senate were to follow through on major treaties that the United States took the lead in negotiating." End quote. Here, of course, he is talking about the Rome Statute. Again, the U.S. would stop crippling our influence on so many fronts, including international criminal justice, by acceding to the Rome Statute. Now, the main issue with the U.S. joining the ICC is that the U.S. would then be held accountable for its war crimes. Thankfully, though, there is a great way to avoid that. Sheffer 23, again, one of the highest authorities on the subject, recommends that in order to avoid the court's rulings while simultaneously helping to uphold international law, the U.S. should not commit war crimes. Life hack. In addition, the U.S. can ensure that it, 1, investigates war crimes if allegations do come up, instead of sweeping them under the rug, and 3, amend U.S. law to account for heinous crimes like genocide. There are, in fact, still some gaps in U.S. law that would prevent the scope of the ICC's jurisdiction from being completely covered by U.S. law, and the U.S. can amend that. Now, there are 2 main impacts to working to regain American moral credibility. Side note, along with many impacts in the debate track brief, these are really probably internal links that lead to better impacts, but given that I don't have those impacts on hand, we are calling these impacts. First, confidence in the global system. Obasi 21, quote, "For the U.S. to refuse to participate in one of the only opportunities for accountability at an international level is hypocritical. To choose not to do so is at best to reduce faith in the modern global system, and at worst to admit that the U.S. is indeed a guilty party, unwilling to face consequences for its actions. Increasing confidence in the global system might lead to even more parties joining such bodies like the ICC, greater cooperation on international issues like climate change and nonproliferation, and a greater incentive for would-be war criminals to not commit war crimes, confident in the international order to bring justice down on their heads. Second, national security. I guess like any topic, the quality of evidence is oftentimes dictated by the credentials of the authors, and sometimes we just have people that, this is the best one in the brief, hands down, probably one of the top 100 people in the world that could possibly talk about this subject. Here's General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. He says of joining the ICC, quote, This is the perfect opportunity to use the court to strengthen our fight against terrorists, as well as our overall national security, and we can do this while still protecting our national sovereignty and military and intelligence personnel. By cooperating, we can help strengthen the power of international action against terrorists and their supporters. Okay, this concludes our arguments for the US joining the ICC. If there's anything I missed, or anything you disagree with, throw it in the comments below and let's debate. Until then, let's take a look at the other side. What are the good reasons for the US to maintain the status quo and stay out of the ICC? Let's start with the fundamentals. The ICC does not need the US to join. Most, if not all, of the affirmative advantages can be scored through US action, but without the US acceding to the court. And second, the ICC has little impact. As of now, the ICC is an impotent, toothless body. In terms of the ICC mission, US membership will do little to nothing at all, because the ICC itself does little to nothing if at all. As we'll see later, though, the ICC is still deeply problematic, and joining the ICC would still be a strategic blunder for the USA. First, uniqueness. Jacqueline McAllister is a poli-sci professor at Kenyon College. She writes about the actions the US could and does take to support the ICC, namely gathering and sharing evidence with the ICC on pertinent investigations. It can do so without joining and without triggering the disadvantages that we will detail later. Now, some scholars disagree with this limited aid. Some see the faults of the ICC as so egregious that US support of any kind should be pulled. In this framing, the US joining is uniquely bad, granting the court a kind of legitimacy from the US superpower that it does not deserve. Schaefer and Stimson are senior fellows at the Heritage Foundation, a consistent friend of the negative side. They say that, quote, the US should no longer grant credibility to the court through participation or support, and the administration should work with Congress to enshrine these restrictions in law, end quote. This, I think, as a negative debater, is the only reasonable stance in this debate. Here's the question: should the US stay out of the ICC and assist it, or stay out of the ICC and oppose it? The question of whether we should join the ICC is really hardly worth debating at all. Now, regardless of AF's half-baked arguments, the US joining would do little to help an organization that's largely toothless anyway. The ICC lacks power for two major reasons. First, it operates on state consent, which it lacks from about 70 countries, including Russia, China, India, Indonesia, US. This means that any crimes that happen in these 70 countries are automatically out of the purview of the ICC. Number two, it lacks any enforcement mechanism. This severely limits the scope and effectiveness. It has no police or agents to apprehend suspects, and no hard power to enforce its mandates. Once it gives a judgment, it relies on the good graces of its member states to carry out arrests, which even its member states frequently refuse to do. In practice, this means that while some politicians may be handed over to the ICC by their political rivals, the ICC can really have no influence over a nation that refuses to cooperate. Again, Fitzgibbon 21, quote, when a nation state chooses to act against its own population, religious institutions and monuments, even perpetuating the most serious crimes against humanity against its own people, international organizations, including the ICC and UN, are for the most part unable or unwilling to act, end quote. Warrants for world leaders, like the ICC's arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Putin, are excellent cases in point. These warrants are symbolic at best, or at worst, an excellent route to destroy confidence in international law. First, respective state governments, the only governments that can help the ICC, won't hand over their leaders, despite the ICC's judgment. And member state governments from other countries also won't hand over foreign leaders, because such actions would be tantamount to declaring war on that country, thus guaranteeing that economic relations are severed, and that is only if they are lucky. So Vladimir Putin is not going to be handed over by the Russian government. He is the Russian government. But likewise, if he visits China, China's not going to hand him over. If he visits ICC member state, they're not going to hand him over. Who's going to hand him over? And that's our big example here. Putin's September trip to Mongolia was met with some calls for Mongolia to arrest him. This, of course, is absurd. Mongolia is not going to declare war on Russia by arresting their leader. Habtom24, University of Cambridge PhD, says, quote, the trip raises recurring questions of the efficacy and wisdom of issuing arrest warrants for heads of state or government. Such warrants risk colliding with the legitimate interests of states and their capacity to conduct foreign policy, at the same time eroding the principles that support accountability for foreign leaders. For national leaders, End quote. In the case of Putin, the Washington Post editorial board agrees, noting that issuing these types of warrants is worse than doing nothing at all, because their apparent lack of enforcement degrades confidence in the international system. Although the Russian-Mongolian power differential is a particular case in point, every country needs to make concessions to defend their interests. For example, although the US was opposed to almost every value of the Soviet Union during World War II, it would have been an unwise play to act that way. Sometimes your mutual goals and friendly relations are more important than virtue signaling. Imagine what would have happened if the US rejected the aid of the Soviet Union because they didn't like them, or arrested Joseph Stalin. Hitler would have won. With that in mind, let's look at the main reason the ICC is a harmful organization: its tendency to reach beyond its mandate and issue rulings on issues it has no business being in. Fundamentally, the ICC's theatrics, toothless as they are, claim far too much power. First, the court operates without sufficient checks. Prosecutors have wide latitude, meaning the court is subject to lobbying by governments and other groups, meaning that the unfair and biased investigations it engages in are hardly surprising. Of course they'd be biased. They have people speaking in their ear about all kinds of things. Bellinger 22 notes that the U.S. has wisely steered clear of this organization until now. Quote, "The U.S. has been concerned from the very beginning that the prosecutor for the court would be given too much power unchecked, and he or she could conduct politically motivated prosecutions of U.S. soldiers." End quote. And indeed, recent ICC investigations of the U.S. and Afghanistan do exactly that, reach beyond their mandate and try to exercise unchecked power for political reasons. Two reasons this particular investigation is absurd. One, the ICC holds no jurisdiction over U.S. military personnel. The U.S. is not an ICC signatory, and joining the ICC would only serve to legitimize an organization that blatantly tries to violate other nations' sovereignty. Second, even if it were an ICC member, the U.S. has already launched hundreds of investigations into misconduct in Afghanistan, and hundreds of individuals have been subject under U.S. law to court-martial, prison terms, and separation from military service. Every allegation of abuse has been investigated, and most have proved to be false. Thus, these investigations are unwarranted and reach beyond the ICC's mandate. Case 2 is Israel. Again, I think will be about the bulk, but a pretty big focus of this debate. The case against Israel may come from a combination of anti-Semitism, groupthink, and moral signaling. Whatever it is not justice. The Washington Post editorial board have an excellent piece on just this, where they explain that although Israel's war should be investigated, Israel shouldn't be prosecuted by the ICC. 1. Its current war is a justified war of self-defense. Just because Israel is winning doesn't mean they're wrong. 2. Civilian deaths can largely be blamed on Hamas's use of civilians as human shields. This is intentional. For example, they set up military bases under hospitals and densely populated areas. 3. Israel is a robust democracy with a free media and self-accountable court systems. Again, the ICC should only be involved in countries that cannot hold themselves accountable, and this is simply not the case for Israel. Quote, "The arrest orders undermine the ICC's credibility and give credence to accusations of hypocrisy and selective prosecution. The ICC is putting its elected leaders of a democratic country with its own independent judiciary in the same category as dictators and authoritarians who kill with impunity." Here, the Washington Post editorial board is referring to the false equivalence the ICC makes by issuing arrest warrants for Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders, not simply for the extremist group that began a war by killing over 1,000 and kidnapping 240 innocent people. These are not equivalently bad groups. Thus, the ICC's current politically motivated vendetta against Israel is a gross overreach of its mission, one the U.S. should not support by acceding to the Rome Statute. Eugene Kantorovich, professor and international law scholar, he's already here. Here he is, Mr. Kantorovich. Quote, "The warrants issued by the ICC against Israel's prime minister and former defense minister represent many historic firsts. They would be the court's first prosecutions of leaders in a liberal Western democracy. The first time the court has accused a country of war crimes during a defensive war against an external invader. For all these juristic innovations, the warrants also represent something entirely familiar: an international institution created to serve high and noble purposes, succumbing to the temptation of pursuing an anti-Israel agenda." End quote. Last, because so many debaters will be sucked into the same anti-Israel propaganda-filled groupthink that the ICC has so neatly slid into, it's worth noting that there is no genocide. This part is a little bit intense, but it's worth mentioning. Raphael Cohen is the director of the Strategy and Doctrine program at RAND's Project Air Force. Excellent piece entitled, "One Step Forward for the ICC, One Leap Backward for Peace." Quote, "The brutal fact is that if Netanyahu and Gallant were the bloodthirsty genocidaires that their critics claim them to be, the death toll in Gaza would be orders of magnitude higher than what we see today. The Rwandan genocide, for example, was perpetrated over several weeks and resulted in 800,000 deaths, often at the hands of mobs equipped with machetes and gardening tools. If Israel was bent on the extermination of Gaza's population, as Khan alleges, Israel certainly has the soldiers, the firepower, the tanks, planes, and artillery, and the opportunity over 8 months of war to inflict casualties on a similar scale. That is cold conflict to those Gazan civilians suffering in the midst of an ongoing war, but it is key context nonetheless." End quote. As Cohen notes here, there is no denying the unspeakable suffering, destruction, and torment that so many Palestinian people are living through. If the term hell on earth has any meaning at all, it applies here. But that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself and provide security for its citizens from a group explicitly out for Israel's destruction. It doesn't mean the ICC has any right to deny Israel such self-defense, and it certainly doesn't mean the US should get on board with such a project. This overreach from the US to Israel and beyond isn't harmless. In fact, these politically motivated investigations into allegations beyond the ICC's purview only serve to harm the ICC's supposed quest to hold war criminals to justice. You and Stradler, both academic researchers, talk about the impact on American foreign policy, but the same could be said for Israel or any other liberal democracy unfairly targeted by the ICC. Quote, "The ICC's actions threaten the only true mechanism for deterring human rights abuses. Subjecting U.S. forces to an after-the-fact and idealistic human rights barometer will only discourage Washington from intervening to end massive human rights abuses in difficult world hotspots. If the global elite wants the U.S. to lead efforts to end killings in places such as Syria, Yemen, or Sudan, the last thing it should do is prosecute American troops when they take on the difficult jobs that no other nation can or will do." The ICC, as we see, is a power... those are those people. The ICC, as we see, is a power-hungry dog that we should not feed by joining and granting it legitimacy. Acceding to the Rome Statute will eat into the very fabric of what makes America a country at all, our national sovereignty. Now, it should be apparent by now that the ICC is not exactly set on following its own rules. Judgments can come down over any matter the ICC deems politically expedient. Joining the ICC, therefore, would unduly constrain the U.S.'s international actions, especially in cases of war, which, as the global protector of the international order, the U.S. unfortunately must wage from time to time. No country in America's position would be wise to join the ICC, and those that have, like this guy, are acting out of a naive delusion about the state of the world and our place in it. Again, Ewan Strandler, quote, "Nations that still might have to wage war, such as the US, Israel, India, South Korea, China, and Russia, have refused to join. America's Western European allies, perhaps still hoping for a utopian future where war has disappeared and mere conventional forces are all that is needed, lend the ICC its greatest support." End quote. US state action is constrained under the ICC. But it gets worse. Acceding to Rome would subject US citizens themselves to targeted ICC investigations. This is not something that the U.S. will stand. Dworkin 20, quote, "The U.S. regards the prosecution of its citizens before an international body without U.S. consent as a violation of its sovereignty," end quote, as it should. And this is why the U.S. has thus far failed to join. Sampson 24, quote, "The U.S. has abstained from membership, seeking to prevent the tribunal from being used to prosecute Americans. There remains fear of actually being prosecuted for political rather than evidence-based reasons," end quote. Such investigations would subject U.S. citizens to court trials without the protections afforded by the Constitution, rights like freedom of speech, trial by jury, and reasonable bail. Those most subject to those injustices would, of course, be U.S. soldiers. the class of Americans dedicated to protecting the rest of us. Throwing them under the bus of a rogue, power-hungry court would hardly be the thanks they deserve. Dunlap 23, quote, ICC legal procedures do not meet the minimum standards of the U.S. criminal justice system. Is it wise or right to tell the less than 0.4% of Americans who have stepped up to serve their country in uniform that they will also be subject to a criminal court system that fails to meet the basic groundwork of the Constitution that they are being asked to go into harm's way to defend and support? End quote. And it's not just soldiers the ICC is a threat to. The ICC has also threatened to prosecute members of Congress for pushback against ICC threats towards Israel. Decent 24, quote, if you want to see just how out of control the International Criminal Court's prosecutor is, consider this. Karim Khan is threatening to prosecute members of Congress who push back on the ICC's unlawful efforts to indict the Israeli leader, end quote. Again, if this is how we're treated before joining the ICC, with threats of arrest of our members of Congress for questioning the ICC's decisions, not for committing war crimes, imagine the treatment we would get after joining their team. Let's end with a couple other DA's small things in comparison to investigating the ICC's overreach and reflecting on America's throwing away her sovereignty, but these are effects of affirming the resolution that we should wish to avoid nonetheless. You might think that the ICC's lack of effectiveness is due in part to a lack of resources. In thinking this, you would be wrong. In fact, the ICC's annual budget is $180 million, but with only 10 convictions so far, ever, that puts their per conviction rate at $230 million per conviction. Hugely funded, pitifully inefficient. And we're not saying here that it's worth spending a lot of money to convict these criminals. I mean, these really are some of the worst people ever in the world. We're really criticizing the ICC here. It could do a much better job with all of these resources. The ICC is also Eurocentric, vastly favoring Western and American-friendly countries. In fact, its investigations of Afghanistan and Israel were remarkable for this very reason. Norton 23, quote, many countries in the global south have denounced the International Criminal Court as a neo-colonial institution, biased in favor of the West. Its leadership has been dominated by Europeans. He goes on to say that the recent arrest warrant for Putin, quote, was issued almost exactly 20 years to the day after the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which caused more than 1 million deaths. Not a single U.S. official was held responsible for the war crimes committed in Iraq, end quote. Now, hand in hand with favoring Western institutions is a seemingly single-minded focus on prosecuting Africans. Again, Norton 23. The ICC is only 21 years old, but has clearly demonstrated an extreme bias towards the global south, and Africa in particular. Africa's intellectuals have since continuously denounced the ICC as a neo-colonial institution. Now, it's not like these are good guys and they didn't do anything wrong. These really are evil people. But the question remains, why does it seem to only be Africans that the ICC goes after? Well, that wraps up negative arguments, wraps up the ICC topic, and wraps up your February lecture. Thanks for watching, best of luck on this topic, and please leave any thoughts, questions, or comments in the comments. As always, remember to be kind to yourself and to the people around you. I will see you next month. Goodbye.